I'm very glad to be here. Actually, I think earlier on when Catherine was asking who had been to the Teachers Institute before, I could have won the prize. This is the 12th. I've taken part in 8 or 9 of them in one capacity or other, and I've always had a wonderful time, and I've really enjoyed listening to the teachers talk among themselves about how to handle complex and difficult subjects. Greg Kimball just mentioned a book, just happened to have a copy with me, called Virginians and Their Histories. It's a new history of Virginia. It came out in May. It's already out of date because the death of George Floyd and the COVID-19 epidemic began. This book was literally on the printing press those days. So it's already a little bit obsolete. But I wrote it with teachers like you as my primary audience. This book contains 2 entire long chapters about slavery in Virginia. It contains a long chapter about racism and Jim Crow and segregation in Virginia. It contains a chapter about the civil rights movement in Virginia. And many of the other chapters also contain important information about race and about class divisions and about various kinds of regional, economic, and cultural diversity within the state. So I'm hoping that this will be helpful and provide some information that you can find useful in the classroom or in discussions with your friends and families and in your neighborhoods. These subjects, slavery, racism, discrimination, white on black violence, they are extraordinarily difficult topics for many reasons. And they're probably more difficult in a classroom full of young mixed race children than in almost any other venue. This is tough. We're talking here about a long historical evolution of events that have brought us to where we are on the 3rd of August, 2020. We'll be a different place tomorrow. This is a constantly changing historical narrative, several centuries long. And one of the difficulties that I always found with young children is that they do not yet have a sense of the degrees of pastness. A sense of the degrees of pastness. None of your students will remember Bill Clinton well. Bill Clinton, George Washington, Julius Caesar will all be equally and implausibly and irrelevantly remote to them. So how do we bring the past from that far back into the present moment so that we can discuss things in ways that we were just talking about in the previous session, which is a tough session to follow. Believe me, that was wonderful commentaries from both participants. I enjoyed it very, very much. One of the things they referred to was a pushback that we get when we try to reinterpret history. My new historical narrative, Virginians and Their Histories, is a reinterpretation of Virginia history. Now, it doesn't change history, it doesn't change facts. What happened, happened. What we are all trying to do constantly is understand that past. And for those of us who live in Virginia, we are trying to understand how that past brought us to where we are today, what that means for us. I mean, there are a lot of people who accuse us of trying to change history. We're not changing history. We're trying to change the way that we can understand and interpret history. Very different thing to do. It's very important that we understand this history that we are a part of. The old historical narrative to which they referred an hour ago is largely a story of democratic triumph and progress of estimable white men in this country. Well, that's only a small minority of the whole population. I happen to be an old white man. You can see that. And the way I learned history was different than a way an African American probably learned history at the same time, or that an Asian American learned history, or an Hispanic American learned history. And it would be different not only depending on your cultural heritage, but where you lived and when you learned. When I was in school 60 or 65 years ago, I learned nothing at all about these subjects. It wasn't until I got into college and started studying American history seriously, then I learned a very different view than I had thought was to be the case. And because I studied history seriously, I was therefore very abnormal. I was very out of sync with most of my contemporaries, and I started viewing the past differently than that superficial view that we gained when we were young. As I say, that superficial view is largely a story of triumphant white Anglo-Saxon America. But that's only a small part of the story. Very small part, actually. It leaves out some of the most important parts. And in fact, we cannot understand the good parts of American history or the good parts of Virginia history if we don't also understand the bad parts. Now, I know that we get a lot of pushback from people who say that what we are trying to do is to rewrite history and to teach a racist version of history or to teach a version of history that is fabricated. Well, we're not. At least I'm not. Because one of the things that disappointed me when I became a serious student of history is how much fabrication I was reading in serious scholarly books on Virginia history and on American history. They were fabricated and they were incomplete. They were superficial. They treated the things that were admirable and ignored the things that were difficult. Think about the Declaration of Independence. We always come back to that. Everything about American history brings us at one stage or another back to the Declaration of Independence. July 1776, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Very similar language was in the Virginia Declaration of Rights of June 1776. Two Virginia documents, two Virginia writers, two of the most brief, concise, eloquent statements of America's goals. We must always keep that in mind. That's what I call revolutionary language of liberty. We come back to that over and over and over again. Much of American history and almost all of Virginia history is in fact a series of episodes in which other Virginians than prosperous, rich, white men tried to take advantage of the implied promise in the Declaration of Independence and in the Declaration of Rights that all men or all people were created equal. That was language they used in the face of George III. But people used that same language and those same ideas and ideals during the campaign for universal white manhood suffrage and for the abolition of slavery during the first half of the 19th century, for the grant of the vote to African American men after the Civil War, for the fight for woman suffrage at the beginning of the 20th century, for the civil rights movement and the women's movement later in the 20th century. Those ideas and ideals drive much of our history. They're much more important to understand than some particular detail. I mean, we understand our history through the details, but the details are not the history. There are people who accuse us who want to study African American history and women's history and social history and poverty and race of ignoring the ideals of the American Revolution. No, we're not ignoring that. We shouldn't ignore that. What we should do is to try to understand our failures to achieve that goal and the progress that in many respects we have made toward achieving that goal. That's why we revise the historical narrative. We don't revise the history, we revise the narrative. People have been doing this from the very beginning. Right here in Richmond, where I live, there used to be Confederate monuments standing in many places, particularly on the famous Monument Avenue. Those monuments were themselves historical interpretations. Public art tells and teaches a story. It teaches a particular version of the past. It doesn't teach the whole past. Now, with that in mind, let's back up a little bit and look again freshly at slavery, racism, discrimination, and white on black violence. I learned nothing about this when I was a young person in school. I learned about it only in college, and I have learned more about it since, and I am still learning. Now, slavery in the beginning, of course, was a labor management system. Slavery was not new in the southeastern colonies in North America in the 17th century. Slavery had existed since ancient times and since biblical times. Slavery existed in one form or another nearly everywhere in the world at one time or another, including in Africa, including in the Americas before the English, French, and Spanish invasions. Slavery was a commonplace institution, but slavery was different from time to time and from place to place. In North America, for instance, Indian tribes oftentimes enslaved people after the end of a war. Same thing happened in Europe. Same thing happened in the Mediterranean. Same thing may have happened in Asia, but I know less about that. At the end of a war, people took tribute. They took slaves. They repopulated their cultures. Now, in some places, they held those people in slavery for life, and in some places, they gradually incorporated them into the society. What's important to understand is that the slavery that developed in the southeastern colonies in North America beginning in the 17th century was a different kind of slavery. It was unusual in the world's history, I think. The people who came over from England and elsewhere were aware of slavery. They knew about this long human habit of conquering and enslaving people. Slavery was fairly commonplace in the Mediterranean. People in the Mediterranean owned slaves. People who came over here knew that. Captain John Smith had been a slave in Turkey at one time. Remember that. They were familiar with this. Even though English law did not authorize people to own slaves, but English law did not prohibit people from owning slaves. People acquired slaves by purchase or inheritance or through warfare, brought them back to England. Some of them were from Africa, some of them were from Italy or from Turkey or from the tribes of Northern Africa. It didn't have to be black. It wasn't based on race. It was based on conquest. So people who came to Virginia understood about slavery. They understood about unfree labor. In fact, many of the people who came to Virginia in the 17th century were unfree laborers. They came to Virginia as you know this, indentured servants. An indentured servant was a person who had a labor contract so that that person would work for a master or a mistress for a certain number of years. That contract was a legal document that specified the responsibilities and obligations and duties of the master and the mistress or of the man or woman who was to perform labor. Those were legal contracts. You had redress in a court of law if your master or mistress abused you or did not feed you properly or did not house you or clothe you properly. The difference between that kind of unfree labor and slavery is that enslaved people had no legal redress at all. They could not sue in order to force their owners to feed them properly, clothe them properly, or not work them to death. The people who were hijacked and brought in here and sold from Africa came over here completely vulnerable. Now, unfortunately, we know only just a little bit about how those people lived and were treated in the early years. I suspect that many of the owners probably treated them the same way as they treated indentured servants, which could be badly, it could be well. They may have let those people go free after a certain number of years. We know that in many instances they tried to hold them into unfree labor for the remainder of their lives. The words slave and slavery appear in very early Virginia records, but that doesn't tell us exactly what their status was because those words did not have a clear, agreed on universal meaning at that time. What we do know is that by the 1660s, those words did have special meanings because the General Assembly of Virginia passed a whole new body of law to govern the institution of slavery. It was a body of law that had no counterpart in England. In England, there was a law of master and servant that governed the behaviors of masters and people who were in unfree positions like indentured servants or maybe an apprentice. But Virginians created their own law, and other enslaved regimes in North America created similar bodies of law. For instance, there's a 1660s law that has a very strange title, a law about the casual killing of slaves. Casual in that law meant unintentional. Under English law, which for the most part was also Virginia law, murder was defined as the intentional infliction of an injury that caused death within a year. But this Virginia law said that surely no person would destroy his own estate by accidentally killing a Negro during correction. Interesting language. What that meant is if you beat a human being to death and that human being is your slave, that's not murder. That's just an accident, because you would not deliberately destroy your own property. That tells us a lot. For one thing, it tells us that already by the 1660s, the slavery as an institution had reduced people from the status of human beings to the status of things, of property, of part of an estate. During that same decade, the General Assembly passed another law that changed English law in a different way. Under English law, a baby inherited the status of his or her father. If you were lucky enough to be born to a royal father, you were royalty. If you were born into a family of the landed aristocracy, then you were an aristocrat. If you were born into the family of farmers, then you were a yeoman. In Virginia, they changed that status of law in the 1660s and stated that every child is to follow the condition of the mother. And they explained what they meant by it, because doubts had arisen whether children of slaves were slave or free, even if the father was English. They decided that all children would follow the status of the mother, so that people who claimed ownership of slaves could claim ownership of the children of their enslaved laborers, whether those children were engendered by rape or other kind of physical exploitation, or even in a romantic relationship. The children became the property of the owner in the same way that a calf or a puppy became the property of the owner of a cow or a dog. Again, we are reducing people to the status of property. Terrible thing to do. They changed another proposition of English law as well. You've no doubt heard of it, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. It was the responsibility of someone who was about to purchase something to ascertain whether that something was sound, whether a horse was lame, whether a laborer was feeble-minded or pregnant or sickly. Those things would affect the cost of the thing to be purchased. You wouldn't pay full price for a barrel of corn without checking to see whether it was rotten. Caveat emptor. However, Virginia planters who made the laws and served as judges on the courts reversed that perception of English law, and they declared that from now on, it was up to the seller to disclose if a slave or a servant was of lame or feeble or of unsound mind or pregnant. Things that a buyer might not be able to ascertain simply by making a cursory inspection of someone whose labor he wished to purchase. And this held up in Virginia court. Again, they have reduced people to the status of property. They did this through violence. Violence embedded in the law, and violence practiced in interpersonal relationships. In fact, slavery could not have existed without violence or the threat of violence. Violence was necessary to the system, and it pervaded the society and the culture based on that system. We know this from innumerable references in surviving records to the punishment of enslaved people. We see it in newspaper advertisements for people who ran away from slavery, describing injuries or marks on their backs from brutal whippings. That was part of the physical evidence on the body of an enslaved person, that he or she had been physically punished, and violent punishments as well. Violence was everywhere throughout much of the colonial period, and all the way up until 1865 in most places in Virginia. The law authorized vigilante groups to ride the countryside at night. They were called patrollers, in order to return people from places where they were not supposed to be to the custody of their owners. We know that a good many enslaved people would go at night to a neighboring farm or plantation where family members lived. We also know that some owners authorized their enslaved laborers to go farther distances away to do some business for the master or owner. Law and custom both required that any time that the enslaved person was outside of the direct control of the owner or overseer, that enslaved person had to have a written notice or pass that was proof of permission. These patrollers would go about looking for people who did not have passes. And the patrollers were fully within their legal rights to beat them, to whip them, to run them all the way back to the farm, and if necessary, to kill them. It was a very violent system. It was exceptionally unpredictable. With this exception, the patrollers were always there. You didn't know what they were going to do or when they were going to do it, but you knew that they could do it. Masters punished enslaved laborers. Patrollers punished enslaved laborers. So did the government. If an enslaved person committed a serious crime, that person could be tried in court. After 1692, however, there was not a jury trial. They did not let enslaved people be tried before juries. They were tried before a court of justices of the peace, who would decide guilt or innocence without a jury and without all of the protections of the common law. The book is stacked against the enslaved defendant and on behalf of the slave owner and the slave system itself. If convicted, enslaved people could be punished in a number of ways. If it's a serious crime, they were usually hanged. And not only that, my work over the years in early Virginia records has led me to discover, more or less by accident, several episodes that suggest that I was finding evidence of something that was commonplace that nobody had ever written up before. And it is this. I have found several examples of a person being convicted of a felony in a county court and hanged. And then an order of court that the body be dismembered and that the head be stuck up on a post beside a public road, and that the body be quartered and the four quarters be stuck up on other posts on other public roads in order to terrorize enslaved people from misbehavior. This is a state-sponsored terrorism. This is a way of trying to control people. This is a brutal and vicious system that in England was applied only to people who made a rebellion against the king, high treason. Violence, or the threat of violence, was constant. It was everywhere. It was inescapable. It was necessary. Now, this is not in any of the books that I read when I was a child. It was in only a few of the books that I read when I was in college and when I was in graduate school. It is now very well known amongst professional historians that this violence was epidemic and pandemic. We know that this violence was everywhere, and we know how it worked, and we know why it worked. We are trying to understand the consequences of that violence. for the people who were its victims. And there were consequences also for the people who were its perpetrators. Back to Thomas Jefferson again. We can never escape Thomas Jefferson. There's a long passage in Jefferson's book, Notes on the State of Virginia, which he wrote in the 1780s, that describes this violence. And he says, a person must be a prodigy who could grow up witnessing these acts of violence and not repeat them. People cite this passage in Jefferson's writing all the time in order to say, look, Jefferson opposed slavery. He disliked slavery. He disliked the violence of slavery. He was anti-slavery. Well, that fourth one is not true. Jefferson made only one or two efforts during his life to abolish slavery. They failed. He retreated. What Jefferson was writing about in that passage was not the terrible effects of the violence that was committed on the bodies of the slaves. He was writing about the violence the damage that violence did to the minds of white children. Much of the literature that people wrote to defend slavery from before Jefferson's time until after Jefferson's time focused on the bad effects for the white people. They seldom talked about the bad effects for the black people, for the property. That's very much worth keeping in mind when people come to us and say, Jefferson was anti-slavery. Don't take Jefferson out. Don't accuse Jefferson of raping his property. Don't accuse Jefferson of being pro-slavery. Well, that's because they're looking at only a small part of the evidence and they're not seeing it clearly. If you look at the big picture, you will see that Jefferson profited from slavery. Jefferson opposed almost every anti-slavery plan in Virginia that anybody opposed, except the two that he invented early in his life and from which he later retreated. Now that's disturbing. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was always one of my heroes. He wrote, all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. That's a very fundamentally important document to all of us. That's our national ideal. But it doesn't make any sense to us in understanding Jefferson and his times and his actions if we regard only that good language in the Declaration of Independence and disregard the bad behavior at the same time. This is commonplace throughout the whole of the period between the American Revolution and the American Civil War. Slavery was the most important economic institution in the United States during that time. I can't say that often enough. Slavery was the one most important economic institution at the time. Without slavery, the cotton mills of England would never have existed in the scope that they did. Without slavery, we would not have the modern American banking system that we do. The large slave plantations in the South raising cotton were amongst the most advanced labor management systems in the world. Those slave labor camps were extraordinarily efficient, and the slave owners documented and increased that efficiency. They operated on an industrial scale. It was human exploitation on a gigantic scale. And it was accompanied by the domestic slave trade. Now, it was commonplace at the time of the American Revolution for people who believed in liberty to denounce the transatlantic slave trade because it was exceptionally brutal. Large proportions of all of the people captured in Africa and put on slave ships died before they even got here. And the ones who got here then were condemned to lifelong slavery. But we now know that between 1820 and 1860, white Virginians sold more black Virginians out of the state than white Virginians had purchased from Africa during the entire of the colonial period. 8,000 to 10,000 men, women, and children a year got sent out of Virginia. White people sold them. Other white people bought them. White people packed them in slave jails or owned slave ships or chained them together in coffles and marched them all the way to Memphis or to New Orleans, where slave markets thrived and where the slavery was the biggest business of all. We don't have exact figures, and we never will, because the records of most slave trading companies have not survived. But there is enough evidence out there to convince me that slave trading was the biggest business in Virginia in terms of money. It is easy to document that the sales of enslaved Virginians during those years, 1820 to 1860, produced more revenue than the sale of all agricultural products in Virginia combined. Now, that's not in most of the books because that's a fairly new discovery, but it really must be there. We must know this. This is big business. This is a modern, complicated business. These slave traders operated as part of the modern finance capital. So, in 1860, a group of Richmond slave traders chartered a bank to help them finance their business, the Traders Bank of Virginia. We need to know these things. These are very unpleasant things. These are difficult things. These are largely ignored things. The old version of American history leaves them out. It's only very recently that we have good literature on the domestic slave trade, good literature on the violence that accompanied slavery, good literature on what the slave system and all this violence did to the families of enslaved people. I mean, we in modern America think of the nuclear family as the ideal norm, 2 parents and some children. Maybe an old granny lives in the house, or an uncle or a cousin or somebody. But that was not the norm for enslaved families. Many families of enslaved people did not even live together. Perhaps the mother and father lived on adjacent farms, or one lived on a plantation and another lived in a town. Where did the children live? What was a slave family? Marriages that enslaved people agreed to among themselves had no standing in law. In fact, they were illegal, which meant that they had no protection in law, which meant that an owner was perfectly within his or her legal rights to sell a parent, to somebody in the city, or to sell a parent to somebody in New Orleans, or to sell a child. And they sold children. We have plenty of records of slave sale advertisements to know that they sold children as well as grown-ups. Thousands of them. So what did that mean for these families, for these individual men, women, and children? Their brothers and sisters, their parents, their children, their grandparents, their neighbors. Well, it meant that separations of family members were probably the norm, not the nuclear family. Separations and breaking up of families was probably commonplace amongst enslaved people. Now, somebody will come back and say, oh, but you look at these wonderful humane planters who frequently would write into their wills that the families that they own should not be separated. Well, some of them did that, that's true. But just as soon as family got sold to somebody else, there was no control over who that new owner would sell them to or break them up. It was a big business of agents in the counties of Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, to go around the countryside buying surplus hands and then selling them to big brokers in Alexandria or Richmond or Norfolk, who would in turn then transport them to the Southwest for sale down the river, as they say. These were commonplace activities. You can look back into the documentary record and you can find a good many descriptions of these chained together enslaved people being marched off to a place they never saw, knew nothing about, and from which they would never see or learn anything about their former family members and neighbors and friends. Every one of those millions of people is a distinct human drama. They're not just statistics. They're not just bit players in a movie. They were human beings, men, women, and children of all ages and conditions. What does that tell us then about the class of owners of slaves? How did they reconcile their Christianity or their beliefs in all men are created equal with the institution that was all around them? What did that mean for them? How did they live with themselves? They did, we know that. We know that a great many of them defended slavery. By the 1850s and the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, anti-slavery thinking had almost died out anywhere from Virginia south. They developed a pro-slavery ideology, a pro-slavery theology, and a pro-slavery economy because they depended on it. Slavery was the most important institution throughout the Old South because it provided the bulk of the labor, agricultural labor, industrial labor, household labor, raising children. The whole culture was based on slavery, and it was good for the enslavers. But how did they think about the enslaved? That's difficult. I mean, you may have to be Shakespeare or Kafka to figure out how they dealt with these internal contradictions of slavery. All men are created equal. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This poses difficulties for the enslaving class. And I think it may be one reason why the enslaving class continued the regime of violence even after slavery was over. Because the pro-slavery ideology and the pro-slavery theology were based on racism, and a fundamentally important belief that people of African origin or descent were inferior to white people. The regime of white supremacy that succeeded the regime of slavery was also based on violence. It was based on racial discrimination. They passed laws to require that racial segregation. They treated black people and white people differently. They allowed it to infest their law. You know, you get up 1896 and you've got Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that states can allow different treatment of people based on race so long as it's substantially equal. Well, that sounds fair, but in practice it wasn't. States in the Old South were industrious in enforcing segregation and separation, and they completely ignored the requirement for equal. The regime of Jim Crow that succeeded the regime of slavery brought us lynchings. Now, lynching was initially just an extra-legal punishment of somebody. Didn't necessarily involve race, didn't necessarily involve hanging. But this white-on-black violence that made slavery possible transformed itself into a different variety of white-on-black violence in the form of enforced racial segregation, enforced white supremacy, and lynching. I mean, you can go back and read newspaper accounts of lynchings, and you can find them everywhere. There were more than 80 documented lynchings in Virginia late in the 19th century. I have no idea how many undocumented cases there were. The victims were virtually always African American and virtually always men. The perpetrators were virtually always white and nearly always men. White-on-black violence continued. White-on-black violence was inescapable before and after slavery. White-on-black violence is, in fact, one of the longest-lasting legacies of slavery. It's rooted in racism. It's rooted in white supremacy. Now, let's think about that from the perspective of noon on Monday, the 3rd of August, 2020. Black Lives Matter is all about white-on-black violence. Most white people don't get it. If they're as old as me, they grew up not knowing that it was important. They didn't know any details. It wasn't in their SOLs or their curricula or in their classrooms or in their textbooks. And it's still not in any of those places enough. Now, I suspect that most African Americans grow up understanding this long history of white on black violence. Maybe it's a part of their own personal histories. People who got abused for driving while black, or part of their family histories, or part of their neighborhood histories, or part of their church's history, part of their school's history. They may not know the details that go all the way back to slavery times, but if you're an African American in this country, or if you're a Hispanic, or if 100 years ago you were Chinese or Japanese, you knew the threat of violence was always there. The discrimination and exclusion and white supremacy were always there. But white people didn't learn about this in their schoolrooms. White parents probably didn't talk about it because they may have been unaware of its extent or of what a horrible blight it was upon the country as a whole. And so, for instance, I know I grew up not knowing that this happened very often, or if it did, it was just an abnormality or a regrettable event of some crazy person. Not that it was a systemic problem that was built into the culture through things that we learned when we were children. This is what's important about education, is how much of what we think we know we learn as children, even before we get to school. I know from my own personal past, I can remember hearing comments, seeing practices and habits of people that taught me unintentionally about race and about class and about gender roles. Some of what they taught me was really very loathsome, and I'm glad I have been able to unlearn it. Some of what they taught me was good. I learned about the Declaration of Independence and that all men are created equal. I saw that all men were not treated equally. And so I began to question, was that language a lie? Was that treatment wrong? How should I behave? We learn about race and religion and gender roles and these other fundamentally important beliefs long before we get to school. But we mustn't let those lessons remain embedded in minds that young without giving them the opportunity to question whether those were right ideas, whether those were right actions. I know I was fortunate in that I began to see the difference between ideas and behavior. And I wondered why. And after I grew up, my study of history helped me understand how that had come about and taught me what I needed to do about it in my own personal life. What we all need to do about it in our collective national life today. White people need to understand this long tradition of white on black violence. Why it is, for instance, that if a black law enforcement officer kills a white person, law enforcement officer is generally going to be presumed guilty. If a white law enforcement officer kills a black person, the white law enforcement officer is probably going to be presumed innocent. Those two assumptions if you're white. If you're black, it's the other way around. That long history of white on black violence explains why, when George Floyd was killed a couple of months ago, most black people assumed that the policeman was guilty until proved innocent. The regime of white supremacy that required racial separation, residential segregation, and subordination of African Americans may have taught white people that a black person was guilty until proved dead. Now that's an overstatement. Don't use that in class or you'll get in trouble with some parent. But think about it as a way of approaching these difficult subjects. Why do we have such different perceptions? People who grow up among racial minorities in this country learn different things from their families and their parents than people who grow up white and therefore more privileged, even if not economically privileged. Our cultures are different. Nice discussion on that about an hour ago, if I remember. It's important to understand these differences so that either we can learn to live with them or we can get beyond them. And that's where teachers have an extraordinarily difficult task and an extraordinarily heavy responsibility, in my opinion. I would have loved it if some of my elementary school teachers had pointed out to me the difference between ideas and behavior when I was younger. And I didn't have to wait until I got to college and was one of those abnormal people who studied history and discovered it. This is a very diverse country. This is a very diverse state. You know, Virginia is more diverse now than ever in its history in terms of class, in terms of ethnic heritages, in terms of race, in terms of religion, and even economic differences in the different parts of the state. If we're all going to claim our own right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the only way we can do that in a culture this diverse is to make certain that everybody else has the same opportunity to claim their own right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in their own way. It means respecting the differences, it means living with the differences, it means understanding the differences if possible. And that understanding, the younger it comes, the better it will be. Children are enormously influenced by what they see and hear, what their parents say and do, what their grandparents say and do, by the stories that their families hand down. If you grew up isolated and talked to nobody else but people of your own race and class and gender, you would have a very limited view of the world. If you grew up in a more diverse habitat with more experiences, more diversity around you, you will have a different kind of view of the world. You will understand things differently. That's the version of humanities education, is to give us an opportunity to understand people whose experiences are different than ours. If we don't understand those people, we are likely to despise those people or to fear those people. That's why I think it's very important that we seize this opportunity as a teaching moment and use it for what's even more important, which is a learning moment. We need to learn why there's so many angry people on both sides of the main question about Confederate monuments, on both sides of the main question about white on black violence in law enforcement community, on both sides of the main question about racial segregation and discrimination. That's a tough burden on the teachers. I haven't taught in many years. I'm not sure I would be up to it. I have, however, studied this history for many years. You know, I read people's diaries, I read their mail, and read the newspaper, read the sermons they wrote and they heard. I look at the art they created, some of it public art that glorified the Confederacy. Look at the buildings they built, sometimes listen to the music that they enjoyed, so that I could understand how these diverse groups of people have been able to live, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not peacefully, in each other's presence. And that's what I have tried to explain in my new book, Virginians and Their Histories. You get a free copy of it for having been part of this Teacher Institute. I think that it will provide some information that will be helpful for classroom activities so that you can help your students come to understand these complex and difficult issues in ways that are important for them, in ways that are relevant for them for today. I noticed that there are some civics or government teachers here. This is perfect. I mean, I taught a government class in high school my first year out of college, and it was terrific. It was fun. It was lively. I could bring in something from the newspaper every day and start a conversation among the students, and that would lead them to learn something about politics, about government, about constitutions, about civilization, about the American way of life. That was ready-made primary sources. Today it's probably going to be on their telephones, maybe they're on the televisions, but People are aware of things that are going on. There's teaching opportunities there all over the place. I found it much more difficult when I taught history because of what I mentioned earlier, is that many of my students didn't have any understanding of the degrees of pastness, or how something that happened 300 or 400 years ago really matters today. That's a big challenge. Think about starting with today and help your students think backwards in time. Why do Black people believe that a white police officer was guilty until proved innocent? Why would a white police officer think that a Black man was inherently dangerous? How did that come about? What undergirds those reflexive beliefs? Why do people believe such things? What can we do and not repeat injurious beliefs and behaviors? That's a tough task. Fortunately now, we do have good historical accounts that help us understand the changes in the past differently, that may help us then explain those changes to the children. Collections of good primary sources that are available in many places can help provide a classroom learning activity. Start with the Declaration of Independence. What did they mean? All men are created equal. Did they mean all male Homo sapiens? Did they mean all Homo sapiens? What about women? How could people who owned slaves write that? What did the people who read that language in 1776 understand it to mean? They understood that language to mean that the politically active nation was not inferior to a king. The Declaration of Independence is a piece of political propaganda. It's not a tract in political philosophy. The Declaration of Independence was written, and so was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, in order to explain why a group of wealthy white adult men were committing a mass act of treason against George III, and to invite other men like themselves to take part. That's why there's that long list of abuses that they heaped on George III to say, this is what bad things he's done to us. He no longer has our allegiance. They were engaging in a political discussion, and politics in those days was the exclusive reserve of elite white adult men. But there's that promise in there that we all want to see. Not all adult white men are created equal, but all people have an opportunity for equality. That revolutionary language of liberty, come back to it all the time. Teach that in the class. Teach that in the class. And then ask students to imagine, if you were a woman in that time, what would you think? If you were a Cherokee in that time, what would you think? If you were a Mohawk in that time, what would you think? If you were an enslaved Black person, what would you think? If you were a free Black person, what would you think? If you were 9 years old, what would you think? And why would you think that? People read those documents when they're new. What they understood is just as important as what Thomas Jefferson understood when he wrote it. What people who read those documents in the decades after the American Revolution came to understand was that that was the promise of America, that they were entitled to take part too. That's powerful. If you go out into a street demonstration tonight or tomorrow night, you probably will not find people quoting the Declaration of Independence. But if you ask them why they're there and what they're doing, they're pursuing that promise of the revolutionary language of liberty. Those ideals are very powerful. Use those powerful ideas to combat equally powerful bad ideas about white supremacy, ideas that appear to justify white on Black violence, ideas that led people to rebel against the United States in 1861 in order to preserve slavery in Virginia, and to preserve Virginia as a slave state within the Union until the summer of 1861, and then to preserve slavery in Virginia and Virginia as a slave state out of the Union afterward. Remember something Dr. Jeffrey said earlier this morning. Don't believe me, don't believe my book, don't believe what anybody else you know says or wrote. Go back and read what white Virginians read and said in 1861. They were fighting to preserve a culture that was entirely based on slavery. It required slavery to work the way that it did, a culture in which white supremacy and white-on-black violence were systemic and indigenous. The people who put up Confederate monuments afterward were revising the historical narrative to say the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. It was about the gallantry and valiance, bravery of those generals on Monument Avenue. That's one interpretation of the Civil War, and it was the first revisionist interpretation of the Civil War. Nobody in 1861 would have understood that. That was a Civil War narrative that was comfortable for some white people. Now, what did the Civil War mean to African Americans? It wasn't about bravery or sacrifice or states' rights. It was about freedom. The most important things about the Civil War, aside from the violence and death, were that it saved the Union. It saved the world's best experiment in representative democracy, and it ended slavery. That's what's important about the Civil War. You won't see that on Monument Avenue. There's only one public art monument in the entire state of Virginia that celebrates the end of slavery. It's a monument to a member of what was called the United States Colored Troops. It's in a military cemetery, African-American military cemetery in Norfolk. There was a soldier from down there who was engaged as a member of the U.S. Colored Troops. There's a monument to him. That's the only one. There is no other monument to the end of slavery. That's worth talking about in the classroom too. I could go on forever, but I shouldn't. I think we ought to stop, and I'll try to answer any questions if you had. It would be better if the teachers would discuss among themselves ways that they have shown will work to teach these subjects in the classroom. Emma, are you moderating?
Yeah, I want to, as Brent said, I want to open it up to you guys, to any thoughts or questions or strategies you might have in teaching this that anyone wants to share with one another. And feel free to just unmute your mic and speak.
I mean, you can always pick an argument with me too, but that's not why we're here. Anybody? Yeah, turn on your sound.
I really like the idea that you had to look at it from different perspectives. And this is the third time I've been to this institute, and you guys always provide such good things when I'm there and I see all these primary resources. And then once the school year starts, I'm really guilty of forgetting a lot of those resources. So I guess my question is, what would be one that you would say, every year you probably need to bring this one up? And I'm not civics, I'm English. I don't know if that makes a difference.
Somebody else should probably respond. Is there some particular documents that you use in the classroom that work especially well? My preference for using the Declaration of Independence, but there are documents that preserve the voices of enslaved people. There are documents that preserve the voices of free African American people. There are documents that preserve the voices and ideas of my class of people. I grew up poor white trash. All of these are different. Surely you've found something that works particularly well on either this large subject or some small part of it. Or does this just demonstrate how tough it is?
Well, and I think as you guys think of this, and that was a great point and great question, Katina. Thank you. One thing that I know Brent has a lot of knowledge about that I've been like learning much deeper about is the 1902 Constitution. And that in particular because, and Brent, you could definitely speak more to why this is so important, but that was I think that was an important document to think about things that affected us until the 60s, like poll taxes. Brent, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's one of many episodes that could be used in a classroom to illustrate some of the consequences of white supremacy. Basically, what happened in 1901 and 2 is that a constitutional convention consisting of 100 adult white men deliberately tried to make it as difficult as possible for black men to vote any longer. Black men had been able to vote in Virginia since 1867. The new Constitution placed many barriers in the way of black voting. Well, there's a teaching question. Why? There's a teaching question. Why? It's much more important to understand why they wanted to do that and the consequences of their having done it than it is to know the details of how they did it. They did it with poll tax and complicated registration processes that also disfranchised a great many white men at the same time. I'm not sure that I would use that Constitution in the classroom, except perhaps at a high school level in a civics course. But for instance, we have on the Library of Virginia website digitized versions of several thousand petitions that Virginians sent to the General Assembly between the American Revolution and the American Civil War. Lots and lots and lots of those petitions concern slavery. One of the interesting and curious things about Virginia law was that after 1806, any person who was freed had to leave the state within a year or be re-enslaved. We have petitions from people who had been freed under the terms of their owner's will, asking to remain. And the reason they wanted to remain is that they would otherwise be separated from their families. What's even more heartbreaking is reading, there must be 24 or more of them, of petitions from recently freed people to the General Assembly asking for be re-enslaved. Now, most people don't know that these petitions exist. And some people used to cite these petitions saying, see, enslaved people were incapable of living in freedom. They knew that slavery was better for them. No. People asked to be re-enslaved in order not to be separated from their families. Families were enormously important. They may have been more important to people whose families slavery had broken up than to the more privileged free people who could stick together. Every family, every slave family is bound to have lost one or more members that way, maybe several. So a document like that can have a profound influence. And you can use a document like that with fairly young children. Somebody once told me, if you make them cry, they will remember. Those documents will make you cry. Yes, Gary?
As far as documents go, relating to like voting rights, I remember I came across some sample questions from literacy tests that was used within the state of Virginia. And I remember some of those questions I couldn't even answer. So I think that would be kind of a good thing to use when we're talking about voting rights and how certain laws restricted how they work to restrict African American voting rights. I was going to say something else regarding, as far as some other documents and primary sources used. Of course, the Library of Virginia, you have the digitized newspapers, and I came across some that had articles dealing with the massive resistance campaign that happened in the 50s to try and resist the integration of public schools in Virginia. So that can be a very good source, I think, too. I was hoping to use that in my lessons, and then the pandemic happened and we were no longer in the class, and I did at least try to put links to some of those articles online for my students to read.
Can I
Very
go?
good. There's a lot of good material like that available. It takes some looking. For instance, there's a wonderful civil rights memorial in Birmingham, and they have a big section there on disfranchisement, and I think it's on their website. Some of the list of the questions that were asked to African Americans. How many grains of sand on the beach? How many bubbles in a bar of soap? You know, a registrar is going to say you gave a wrong answer because there ain't a right answer. It's a non-question. But that kind of chicanery was commonplace throughout the first half of the 20th century. Mark?
Yeah, can I piggyback on what Barry said? I've also used those literacy tests with middle schoolers, and they're really a great resource. And there's a few, especially from, I think from New Orleans and some other places in Louisiana that are downloadable, where you can print off the whole literacy test and give it to your kids. And it is really difficult. I wanted to also speak to the digitized newspapers. I don't know what forum it was on, but somebody had just posted a lot of original responses from the early 20th century from the Richmond Planet about what the Black community the thoughts of the Black community on the newly erected then Confederate monuments. That was really telling. And I had a quick question. Does the Library of Virginia, I know they've got lots of digitized newspapers. Do you have old copies or digitized copies of the Richmond Planet or other Black newspapers?
The Library of Virginia has a very large collection of the Richmond Planet. We have some it is originals, some of it is microfilm, and we have digitized and put on the library's website almost all of the early surviving copies of the Richmond Planet. On the various resources of the Library of Virginia, there is something called Virginia Chronicle, and you can read the Richmond Planet there.
That's local for us here in Richmond, but it's been a great resource, especially just to get what the perspectives were from. We have so much commentary on the monuments, especially here in Richmond, from current times. It's nice to see what different communities were saying about them, 100 years ago. So anyway, just an interesting.
Well, I think it's very good when possible to use a local for instance in your classroom. But if you don't have a local for instance, you could use something from a different place, even from New Orleans, and say, look, this went on here too. This was commonplace. This is what white people did to Black people once upon a time. Maybe some of my ancestors did to some of your ancestors once upon a time.
We are just about wrapping up for today's session, and I definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time today. So I'd like to thank you, Brent, for speaking, and thank all the teachers for bringing up really good points and thoughts. And I know it's a lot today to sit and think about, so hopefully everyone can kind of reflect, and we can come back tomorrow with kind of renewed energy and thoughts. And we'll have some time tomorrow too to kind of just reflect on what we've been learning today. And just a couple follow-up things. I want to follow up on what Mark mentioned about, and I dropped it in the chat for the Richmond Planet. The Richmond Planet is a really good source even throughout the state of Virginia, particularly because John Mitchell Jr., we have him in our Virginia Changemakers, I believe, in our resource that I can drop in here, but a lot of people, especially in Richmond, have been bringing up his name. And he was really an interesting guy. And I can't do him justice, as I know Brent or Errol Some could speak about him, but He's definitely a good figure to research and learn about. And he was 21 when he became the editor of the Richmond Planet and was the editor there for 45 years. And he's in our Richmond curriculum. Thank you, Megan. So definitely someone to look up. And I also just want to mention something that I've been thinking about as we've been listening to these conversations today. And that is something that the library is actually looking at also, is the language of what's used historically and how and what kind of language is appropriate to use in the classroom. And I think everyone kind of has to do their own researches on what is comfortable for people to use. But I do want to share a couple resources. So as we talk about enslaved peoples, and language is hard. Words change and the way that people identify themselves change. I know, for example, I'm Asian American, and as we start to move towards being inclusive, one of the terminologies we've started moving towards is Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, to make sure to intentionally include Southeast Asians. So just in thinking about language, I think it's important to look at these two resources that I just dropped on the language of slavery. There is kind of a push to move towards freedom seeker versus fugitives, and slave holder rather than slave master and slave owner, as well as enslaved peoples versus slaves, because it really is demonstrating the condition of an individual within the society. It's not an internalized condition. And as well as the terminology for American Indian. I know that is also something that I'm sure people have been struggling with. So the American Indian Smithsonian Museum has mentioned that all of the terms are acceptable for American Indian, Indian, Native American, or Native or Indigenous peoples. What I've been seeing is more people referencing themselves as Indigenous Americans or Indigenous peoples, but I think most importantly, people prefer to be called by their tribal name. So I think those are important things to be thinking about when you're approaching these topics in the classroom, is what kind of language are you using, and are you being intentional with your language? And I'm sure you guys have also already been thinking about this, already been approaching this. I'm sure it's the same with preferred pronouns and thinking of referencing to people and folks. But I just wanted to toss that out as something else to think about as we approach this history. Catherine, did you have anything else to mention, or Ashley?
No, another great resource that the library has is our Native American Research Guide, and that has different information for all state recognized tribes as well as the federal recognized tribes as well. And our state federal recognized tribes just increased last.
Thank you, Ashley. And Ashley worked really hard on that, so that is updated. Catherine, any other thoughts for closing up today?
Yeah, Emma, I'll just jump in. I dropped in the chat, going back to John Mitchell Jr. and the Richmond Planet. The library worked with the American Civil War Museum and the Valentine and maybe somebody else. It was actually a few years ago, kind of on the history of the monuments on Monument Ave as they were erected. And I know that somebody from the American Civil War Museum actually came and looked at some of the non-digitized Richmond Planet papers that we have, particularly to get the African-American perspective of these monuments as they're going up. And some of that is available on that website. If you haven't checked it out before, it's on Monument Ave. It's really, I think in today's day, really useful, and gives you and your students the context in which these monuments were erected. And so I just wanted to share that. Also, I didn't know if anyone wanted to sort of share. I think tomorrow when we start in the morning, we're going to take a few minutes to kind of do some reflection that anyone might want to share. But if anybody wanted to say anything right now, feel free.
So I just wanted to say real quick, I'll be entering my third year teaching, and every year when like I get new perspectives about, and especially the 2 sessions that we had today, it really helps me kind of think about what my big ideas in the classroom are going to be. And I really am looking forward to looking through the book that will be provided, just because I've gotten so many ideas that I jotted down while I was listening to the talk. So I'm really excited about this year. I know that there'll be a lot of challenges, but I think that it's also kind of a good way to reimagine, you know, my personal teaching, like what I will focus on and, you know, what I'll try to highlight in the classroom.
Thanks for sharing that, Jessica. Any other thoughts or feedback or concerns?
I would say, just listening to the 2 sessions, they gave some really good information. And even though, the topics are going to be a little too advanced for my age group, just, learning, and discussing differences, something that, we strive to do with the little people. So it's given me, some more ideas of, some of the topics that, I can talk about with them and how to make it, more digestible for them.
That's great. Thank you, Daryl. And I think that hopefully people can share. I think that's one place I struggle with is I'm used to teaching college students. So it's good for you guys to share with me too, and with one another, how to approach this with little people. And maybe that's with images, maybe that's with activities. So I'd be interested for everyone to kind of reflect on that. And I'd love to hear thoughts as we go through the next couple of days on that.
Emma?
Yes.
I just feel that I've taught African American history for a long time and all, and I just love Brent's phrase, degrees of pastness, because today, in the climate that we're in, people seem to think that there's being led by young people. However, during the 60s, that movement was led by very young people as well. So it wasn't Black Lives Matter. It was say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. So we've had all of that. And so it is a degree of pastness. But I think that if you're a teacher and you are white or of another nationality, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask students questions, because they know their culture, they know what they believe, they know what they feel. Don't discount their feelings as, oh, you're just a little kid. Don't tell them that you don't see color, because that's saying you don't see them. Be honest with them and let them ask questions, and if you don't know, you don't know. So that's what I have to say about it.
That's great. Thank you, Daryl. And I think that brings a point up to my specialty is Asian American history, and there's so much intersectionality of what we learn from Black history and ways that, the term Asian American came out in the 60s, and so much of that was out of pride and civil rights. So I think, like, even when thinking of your diverse classrooms, beyond just Black and white, there's a lot of intersectionality and a lot of ways that these histories connect. Yeah, Barry, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of related to that, was back when the shooting occurred at the Florida high school, and all across the country, students were doing these walkouts of school to draw awareness to gun violence. And I remember seeing and hearing a lot of people disparagingly talk about, oh, these kids don't know anything, blah, 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 blah. And I just thought to myself exactly that. Back in the 60s, it was the young generation that were trying to push for integration of schools and ending racism in society. So, that's what we need to do as teachers, is to encourage the youth to become active in society and let them know that it doesn't matter if you're not 18, you're not old enough to vote yet, your voice, you still have a voice and your opinion still matters.